friends. Welcome back to Reading the Pattern. I'm Rebecca, and obviously it's been a long time since I've been here talking to you on this channel. So thank you for clicking and watching, and I will talk about that in a little bit. But for now, I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of what this video is going to be about. As always, I am going to be talking about the Wheel of Time, but in this video, there will be no spoilers for the books or the TV show. I'm just going to be talking around some background information about production. If you are watching this video, you have most likely seen a recent video from my friend John at What Up talking about some potential news for the production of season 4 of the TV show. There has been a lot of discussion in the fandom on this news, as you would expect, and I did want to offer my own perspective because I do have a lot of thoughts on it, and it really seemed like this was the best platform for me to share those thoughts. It's on YouTube, as the original video was, and even though I haven't been using this space recently, this felt like the right time to use my little platform to share my thoughts. I do all of this with total respect for John as a person, as a fan of the books and the show, which I know he cares about, and I do fully believe that he was offering this information with good intent towards the show and meaning to have that be a positive thing that he's putting out into the fandom. So I do truly believe that, even though I may have a different take on it. I just wanted to stress that this is not me beefing with What Up. I want to very briefly touch on two other things before I dive into this news. Number one, very briefly, and I will save more details on this for later in the video for those who are looking for an update on me and this channel, but if you were wondering where the heck I was for several months, I'm okay. I just did have a lot going on, which I will get into more later. And in regards to this channel, had a lot of difficulty with a video that never got released for episode 6 of season 2 that just kept getting blocked and blocked and blocked on YouTube. Very frustrating and demoralizing, and definitely led to me wanting to take a break from making that kind of content. But I am glad to be back and talking with you. Secondly, I wanted to share some information about a really amazing project that is happening right now. This is time sensitive, so something that you as a Wheel of Time fan might be really interested in, and I wanted to let you know about.
There is a Kickstarter for what is called a soundscape for the Wheel of Time audiobooks. So this is a project that would accompany the existing Wheel of Time audiobooks that are currently available as a full set, narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. And the narrators, by the way, fully support this project and are excited about it, as am I. So let me tell you a little bit more about what is a soundscape. The creator, Jordan Rennells, has done this kind of work before on other major titles, including The Lord of the Rings. And you can hear some really incredible samples on the Kickstarter page. So I highly recommend you check that out so you can get an idea of exactly what this would sound like. Jordan is adding layers to the existing audiobooks to make it a more immersive experience. So there's ambient sounds that match the scenes happening in the story, sound effects to correspond to specific actions occurring in the story, and then an original score that goes along with it, really making it a much more cinematic, fully immersive experience. I'm so excited to see how this turns out.
So let's dive into this news from What Up. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you who are watching this video will have already seen that video, but just in case you haven't, I'll briefly summarize the news that he shared. And of course, you should go check out the full video if you would like to see all of the information that John was sharing and the way he was offering some context to that. So the pertinent piece of information here is that John went to sources that he has close to production of the show, asking specifically for any information that they could share in regards to green lighting for season 4. Has it happened yet? When might it happen? And so on. And so he did get one source close to production to give him some perspective on that. And I should have added that after the original source gave him this information, he did find a few others who were willing to corroborate that. So this person is telling John that season 4 has not been greenlit yet, which I do think is consistent with other information that we have, so I will share that later. And going further to suggest that perhaps season 4 may not be greenlit in the same fashion that previous seasons have been. And so this would potentially be a departure. The idea here being that executives may be waiting for results of how season 3 does before deciding whether to greenlight season 4 or not. Previously, the greenlight decision for each season, for seasons 2 and for seasons 3, has been made prior to the release of the previous season. There has understandably been a lot of response in the fandom to this speculation, I'm going to call it. And I will explain a little bit further why I do really feel that it is speculation and why I personally believe that a definitive decision about when to potentially greenlight season 4 has probably not happened yet. I will explain that. But for now, I'm going to just say this is speculation. And there's a lot of reaction to that in the fandom, understandably. And a lot of what I do want to focus on in this video is that fandom reaction, what we tend to see, and hopefully kind of offer my perspective, my critical thinking, I hope, and calm the waters a bit. A couple of caveats here. I'm not trying to say that I think John was saying this decision has already been made. I don't think he was saying that either. Another caveat being that I don't personally have separate sources close to production who are giving me information on this. That's not the kind of content I do, so I don't seek out that kind of information, and I don't have it. While I hear that some other people may have their sources who might be telling them different things, I can't speak to that directly. So I'm not basing my thoughts on that whatsoever. And primarily basing my opinion that this decision hasn't been made yet on information that we have gotten from Sarah Nakamura. And you've certainly heard me talk about her on this channel before, but just in case, if any of you are not as familiar with her or need a reminder, she is the Wheel of Time TV show's book consultant. She has been working on the show from the very beginning. Her work is heavily involved in the writer's room of the show with other designers and creators on the show. So she has a really big influence, and most importantly, she has very intimate familiarity with the timeline for production that the show has gone through up till now. Sarah has been wonderful about giving us more specific information lately about those timelines. So she shared on July 12th that she begins working on her prep before a writer's room for a season convenes. And she gives a lot of wonderful detail here about the kinds of information that she provides that they use to then start working on scripts. And as she clarifies here, at that time, she hasn't done that for season 4 yet. Going further, on the same day, she points out they'd only been wrapped on season 3 for 3 months. And she clarifies when season 2 wrapped, it took 6 months before she got the call to start her season 3 writer's room prep. Even more detail here, where she explains that she didn't know season 3 was confirmed, and then she got the call and was in London 4 days later to start that work. So, this explains a little bit that yes, there will be a decision that's happening before Sarah knows about it, and she may find out about it right before the work is about to begin, as she did for season 3. The timeline she's sharing suggests that we're well within and less than the time it took them last time to move from wrap on one production to greenlight on the next. Now, Sarah has had more to add to this more recently since this recent news got posted, so I wanted to dig into that as well. Big Gay Will on Twitter, and yes, I am still going to call it Twitter and tweets, tweeted that someone made a video about rumors that season 3 needs to do much bigger numbers if we want season 4 to happen. It's caused a bit of a panic. And Sarah responded, "That's not how things work, not with streaming services, or at least not from my experience." So the first part of this, I just, want to get into it a little bit here. She's saying that's not how it works. And we know that's not how it has worked, right? And the rumor here being that, hey, it might work differently in season 4 than how it's worked before. Okay, it might. And again, I would look at that as 100% speculation at this point. With Sarah's additional context here about the timelines, how they've worked in the past, and us being well within that timeline, way less time has gone by than had gone by in previous seasons before a decision like that has been made, there's really no reason to assume that a definitive decision has been made at this point. That in and of itself, deciding sooner would be a departure from what we've seen. Now, Sarah does go on to add that things have changed a bit, and she's pointing to the 2 recent huge strikes that are still having an impact even after they've been resolved on the industry. And she's telling us to manage our expectations and expect that the timelines from previous years might increase. And in fact, she suggests they might double. That may just be a generalization that she's using here, but just warning us that things may take a bit longer because that's what we're seeing in the industry at large. Sarah also offered one more really interesting perspective that I'm going to come back to later when I start to get into like, well, what can we as fans do with this potential information? We do have a lot more information on the specific timelines of production, and a lot of this information has been shared by WattSeries.com, which I always use as a really wonderful source on production news and information. And I know that my friend Lauren from Unraveling the Pattern is going to be putting out a video talking about this topic as well, where he'll really dive into that. So that may be out already, or if not, it will be out soon. And you should definitely check that out when you do see it. What I'm seeing a lot in the fandom is people running with the idea that, yeah, this decision may have been made already, and then having a very strong emotional response to that. So I've shared my reasons for thinking that this decision hasn't been made yet. And that the more likely explanation for the information being shared with John is that, yeah, there probably would be people close to a production who are at least willing to speculate about the possibility that things might happen differently. And that's really how I see it. I see it as speculation about something that might happen but hasn't been decided yet. So there's two big things that I see constantly in the fandom whenever fans are worried about renewal of the show. And there's two big things that people seem to point to all the time. Number one is marketing. How much marketing does the show get? Is it adequate? Is it being marketed appropriately? And so on. And John got into that in his video too, so I will touch on that. And then the other thing that I see people worrying about a lot is the timeline between seasons. And so I also want to talk about that as well and my perspective on that. So as What Up brought up in the video, when talking about marketing, it's hard to get firm data on this because companies don't necessarily want us to have that data on how much they're spending on marketing. So you can find some industry reports on this, some of which is estimations. And so I just want to stress that, if we knew for sure X amount of money is being spent on marketing for Wheel of Time, X amount of money is being spent on other comparable shows, and he used Rings of Power and House of the Dragon as two other comparable shows. And if we knew those differences and we knew those exact numbers, that would be fair information to use to say what is being invested in marketing on these different shows. Rings of Power is truly an exception in the Prime Video world in terms of how much they've invested in that show. And it's actually really hard, I think, to compare to it. Even though they're similar genres of shows and they're on the same platform, I think it's hard to compare anything to that because it really is in another league if we look at other types of shows on the platform. House of the Dragon, I will also say, is really in another league in terms of how much money gets invested in that show, and particularly on marketing. It is on a different platform. HBO is really on a different level. Their whole approach is different, and I think it's very hard to make comparisons among these. John actually makes a good point in his video about how proportionally Wheel of Time is performing almost comparably to Rings of Power, slightly less in terms of its performance from the information we have, which is limited and incomplete, but from the information we have, it's performing in a similar realm to Rings of Power while actually receiving way less in terms of marketing and costing significantly less. So that's actually a positive for the Wheel of Time. And the one thing that I will stress here, not just in that video, but just general fan response to this, is I see a lot of assumptions from fans that executives in these companies have no idea. They don't realize, oh, wow, Wheel of Time is actually performing really well considering it gets fewer resources and it costs less. And you should really be excited about this show that actually costs less and is performing similarly with fewer resources. And we don't know that they don't. I think that's just pure assumption on a lot of fans' part, that they are not aware of that information. When it comes to marketing, one of the things I see in the fandom constantly is people complaining about marketing for Prime in general and Wheel of Time in particular, and complaining that it's not enough, it's not effective, it's not the right kind of marketing, all of these sorts of things. And that's always given me a lot of pause as a fan, hearing those kinds of arguments. Like, I think we jump to a lot of conclusions, right? If we don't see something, we maybe jump to the conclusion that nobody is seeing something, keeping in mind perhaps that marketing towards us, people who are already invested in the show, may in fact be different, that we may not see the same things as someone who is the person that they're trying to potentially target with their advertisement. I'll see people pull out really anecdotal examples of someone on Twitter saying, hey, I just heard that Wheel of Time has a season 2. No one told me. And we'll use that as an example of, oh, the marketing is terrible and people don't know about it. And I would just caution that there's always going to be specific cases like that. And we shouldn't assume a broader strategy or a broader failing based on sort of anecdotal pieces of information like that. I think it's really important to point out that while we as fans might want to see marketing happening on a certain timeline, that has nothing to do with what these companies have determined is their optimal strategy for when to market things. So I don't think that our random worries are really a good indication of whether a marketing strategy is appropriate. I think the only thing that's truly hard information is the numbers. How much is spent on marketing versus this versus that? And again, I wouldn't expect to get the same number as Rings of Power. I would love it. I wish they would, but I don't expect it. And I think that's just really out of bounds and doesn't really take into account that some of the things that we're trying to compare Wheel of Time to are kind of exceptional in one way or another. But I would just really caution people not to jump to the conclusion that because presumably less money is being spent on marketing Wheel of Time than is being spent marketing Rings of Power, that that's in any way indicative of the platform not supporting the show, but rather just that probably nothing is going to compare to Rings of Power. And it's not a fair comparison. The other thing I firmly believe is that Rings of Power doing better on Prime Video would be a good thing for the Wheel of Time show, not a bad thing. I think that the platform likely sees synergy between these two titles, and if they're committed to Rings of Power, and if Rings of Power does well, that would only potentially help Wheel of Time. I don't think they see them as being in competition with each other, but rather synergistic. That's my impression, but I personally think we should want Rings of Power to do well as it can, because I think that helps Wheel of Time, not the opposite. I want to touch upon the concern a lot of fans have about the longer gap in between seasons of the show. We had just short of 2 years in between seasons 1 and 2, and we're looking at probably a similar time gap between seasons 2 and 3, at least a year and a half, if not again, close to 2 years. While I certainly share this concern in general, if the show is going to go a full 8 seasons and would love to see them get that gap down to about a year and a half, I think we really have to put this in the context of what is happening in the entire industry. When Wheel of Time Season 1 was released, it was not clear at that time that this was going to be an industry-wide trend. And yet, by now, years later, it's pretty obvious that it is, and that Wheel of Time is not exceptional in this way, and it's becoming the norm. So as much as we don't like it, it does make me feel a bit better now that I can see how Wheel of Time fits into a trend, and that if they're able to shorten that gap much below 2 years at all, it could actually be a bit ahead of the curve. One show in particular I think is worth discussing, and that is Bridgerton. Even though this is on a different network and is a completely different type of show, we've had confirmation recently that the gap between seasons 3 and 4 is going to be at least 2 years. But I think it's interesting because Bridgerton is another show that has a planned 8 seasons. And the other thing is that as much as Netflix doesn't commit to a lot of its shows, I think Bridgerton is one that it has committed to. So I think it really does want to do the full 8 seasons. Now, it's a different kind of show with more variation in the cast, so it's truly not the same. Nevertheless, it seems that these streaming platforms are banking on fans getting used to this concept of a 2-year wait. We might kick and scream, but what else are we going to do? So then we get to the question, if they were going to wait for information from season 3 to decide whether to continue on with season 4, what would that be? What sort of metrics would they look at? And this is an interesting question because Prime is a strange platform in terms of how they market themselves, who buys their subscriptions, where they get their money from, and so on. So it's a very interesting question. I don't think there's a totally clear-cut answer here. We're kind of used to just looking at pure viewership numbers, which is hard enough to determine in and of itself. But then there's the question of, is that the primary metric, or are there other metrics? And what should we as fans be concerned about? Sarah shares here that when it comes to streaming platforms, the biggest thing they look for with a premiere is not viewership, it's new subscriptions. how many people bought a subscription in the 24 hours prior to the release. And as she points out, on a platform like Amazon, it's harder to quantify because they offer services other than just streaming. And so, of course, when people are signing up for their service, it's not just for streaming. That's not the main thing necessarily that brings in new subscribers. But for them, bottom line, it's all about new customer acquisition. That's how they are kind of judging sustainability. She also goes on to point out about how there's this new ad feature on Prime. She thinks that's a good thing, and that can be helpful in perhaps looking at historical data to project revenue rather than waiting for another season. So she offers a bit of hope there and how this new change in their strategy could actually be useful for the show. As I pointed out earlier in this video, I don't typically have sources of information independent when I'm talking about things, but I will say, since Sarah has put this out here, this is something I have heard separately from other sources, this piece of information about new subscriptions. And it's not something we're used to thinking about. Again, we're used to thinking about views. But I think it's something we should pay attention to and focus on a bit more than we focus on viewership numbers. I think Sarah's giving us a good point in a useful direction. So I've seen some fans suggesting that they may, in fact, if they can, unsubscribe and subscribe again right before we see the next season of The Wheel of Time. If that's something that is plausible for you, that's something to consider. Now, I don't know for sure how they look at that, if there's any difference in terms of previous subscribers who have paused and then resumed versus brand new subscribers, but it seems like it might still be relevant. So I'm bringing this into the discussion because I think a big part of why John wanted to release this information was in hopes that it would somehow trigger fans to respond in a way that could help the show. I have mixed feelings about this because I think that there are things that we as fans are not a replacement for. We're not a replacement for broad marketing. Nothing that we do with our small individual word of mouth is going to be a replacement for that. And I don't think we should put that kind of pressure on ourselves as individuals to try and do that. But that shouldn't stop us from having conversations in spaces where we might bring in new fans. It shouldn't stop us from doing all the things that we do on social media to try to be a welcoming fandom, to encourage and bring in new people and have conversations about the show in all sorts of spaces. I do think that's positive. I think just give yourself a break as you're doing this and recognize that it's about fun and community building, and we're not marketers. John had said on Twitter after putting out this video that he honestly considered not releasing it. And I think this is where we actually probably would differ the most in terms of our perspective on this information. I think maybe up till now, the things I've been saying, we maybe agree largely. And from my perspective, I think I come out on it in a different way. And I suspect that it may in fact harm because, well, it may light a fire under some fans, and that we can see that maybe happening. There's a limit to what even really fired up fans can do on this topic. And I think there may in fact be other fans who watch, have an emotional reaction to it. It may discourage some, and it may actually reduce some fans' investment in the show instead of increase it. And so I see a lot of potential for that. What I see mainly is that when something like this happens, people have an immediate, visceral, knee-jerk emotional response. And I knew I would have that if I watched it right away. So I didn't. I waited and came back to it later when I was in a good space to do that. But many people don't. And as much as I might try to encourage nuance and balance and a broader discussion, many people will not engage with that. And more people will just watch it, take in that news, have an emotional response, and react in some way. Maybe increase engagement, maybe decrease engagement. And my worry is that it may decrease engagement more than anything. So what I would say gently and respectfully is that while I fully believe that the intent here is good, I tend to fall to a different conclusion, which is that the limited number of fans that this may fire up and the limited impact that those fans can have doesn't outweigh the potential for other fans to be disengaged by this information. And that is a larger concern for me. And so I, if it were up to me, would come down the side of, no, I wouldn't share this piece of information. And again, I'm not making that call. I don't have that kind of channel. I know there are other creators in the fandom who do similar kinds of things, and they make their own calls. Everybody has to make the call for themselves. So that's just, I'm offering that perspective in this particular case. with an ear to the fandom and what kind of reactions we're seeing. So I think that's sort of the end of what I wanted to say on this particular topic. And, a lot of it boils down to gird your loins, my friends, as I always say. But before I wrap the video for today, I will share just a little bit more detail for people who are interested in my channel and what's been going on and what might be going on the channel. So if you're interested for that, please stick around. My hiatus from making content was really triggered by working very hard on my season 2, episode 6 video, trying many, many different ways, trying different resources to get that video to be able to be published on YouTube, and I could not do it. When I talk about the show, when I do breakdowns of episodes, I was trying to find a sort of middle ground where I can add more of a breakdown, more of a discussion to the episode. It's not just my immediate reaction, right? Lots of people do that. I wanted to do something that's a bit different, and I'm not able to do the fully in-depth sorts of breakdowns that take months like Lauren on Unraveling the Pattern does. I was trying to find this sort of intermediate lane in which I can exist. And yeah, it's been very hard to try to find a way to do the kind of content that I want to do. So it doesn't mean that I won't do content around the show again when we have more news to talk about. My perspective has always been trying to talk about the show as an adaptation, trying to bring my perspective on how things are getting adapted and why, and my take on that as a fan. And I still get excited and enjoy talking about those things, but I have to find a way, if I'm going to do that, to do it on a timeline that works for me and with whatever way I can to work with YouTube, which has been extremely challenging. I've spent a lot of time in the Wheel of Time fandom working on WatCon as the programming director. That takes a lot of time during certain parts of the year. I would like to figure out a way for that not to completely take up my time for, maybe a solid 3 months and partially take up my time as much as it does for many more months beyond that. So maybe I'll be able to streamline that. And that is something I do plan to continue doing. And obviously participating and contributing to other types of content is something I will continue to do as well. For some life updates, just a little bit of perspective. I have been going through a divorce for some time, and that's sort of ramped up this year, and that's taken a lot. And it's been ultimately a good thing for me, but it is something that has taken me away from this channel. And there's other projects that I want to work on. I want to be working on a book that I have started but stalled on. So that is something that I want to be doing. So with all of that said, I don't know what sort of timeline I will be putting out content on the show. I think it will be sporadic, most likely, and we'll certainly ramp up when we have new content to talk about. But just, wanting to sort of be transparent about that and what to expect. I have one interesting prospect that I want to pursue that would be something very different that I would like to bring to this channel. If I can do that, I would love to do that. It will be a fun surprise. I'm not going to say anything more because I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it, but I will see what I can do and hope that those of you who are watching this are interested enough in my content that you will come to watch when there is something to watch. And I fully appreciate all of you for your involvement, for any comments that you leave. I love to hear from you. And, especially when we're promoting respectful, in-depth conversation, which is what I want to do. So I will leave you with something I have absolutely missed saying, and that is, gird your loins, my friends.